Exclusively on Secular Media Network, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Hello and welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I am your host, Callie Wright, joined by my co-host, Ari Coleman. What's up, Ari?
Actually, by the time this comes out, it's going to be Ari Stillman.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
My name change is tomorrow. We are recording this on Sunday the 24th. So by the time this releases on Wednesday or Thursday, depending on if you're a patron or not, I'll be Ari Stillman. Hopefully.
Joining me is my co-host, Ari Stillman. What's up, Ari?
Hey, smoke weed every day. As I do.
Okay. Oh, the intro to the show got so much more fun when you became a part of the show. I just want to throw that out there.
Well, yeah, because before it was just like, hey, I'm Callie. This is my show. The end.
Thanks for making me feel good about how good the show was before you came on. I appreciate that.
I mean, it was good, but it wasn't just quite at that level that it needed to be at.
Right.
I think I've brought that to the show.
I think I agree. So today we're going to have a super interesting conversation. We're going to be talking about chronic illness, disability, what it's like to navigate the world when you're a person who's affected by that, and more especially as a skeptic, as an atheist, someone who doesn't buy into the woo and all of that kind of stuff. So our guest this week is author Ania Bula. She has written a book called Young, Sick, and Invisible, A Skeptic's Journey with Chronic Illness that comes out very soon. Ania, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, why don't we start just kind of give us an overview of your story. What led you to write the book?
It's sort of a combination of things. My story, I always thought it was pretty interesting because I went through such a hard time trying to get my diagnosis, and I thought that this was uncommon. Little did I know at the time how frequent that story actually was. And I was writing about my experiences on my blog, which was Scribbles and Rants at the time, and I was getting a really surprisingly positive feedback on some of the stories that I was writing that dealt specifically with my Crohn's. And around that time as well, I was struggling with money because I had just applied to go on disability and I wasn't working. So the only money that was coming in was the money that my partner got for being a TA. And so we didn't even have enough to cover our bills. And so I was looking for a way to make some money, which sounds like a really weird thing to say about a project that is very much a passion project for me. But that's what gave me the idea to create an Indiegogo. And as I was looking at that, I was thinking, okay, well, what do I want to do? And immediately an idea my mom had given me several years before popped into my mind, which was, why don't you write about your illnesses and what you went through? And so just sort of on a lark, I gauged some interest, whether people were interested by putting together the Indiegogo, and the response I got was huge. I started hearing from people who were in the U.S. or basically just across the globe who were messaging me saying, oh my God, I'm so glad you're writing this because this has been my experience, or I finally realized that I wasn't alone or that this wasn't strange. And which is really funny because you usually hear that after you finished writing the book, right? Or at least you hope to hear something like that after you finish writing the book. But instead I was hearing it sort of before. And so when I sat down to write it, I was just like, I have to be completely and brutally honest. I have to talk about basically the hardships that I went through, the good things that I went through, the things that were my own fault. And I just sat down and I started writing it, and out came the words.
Yeah, and I was fortunate enough to get a copy to read in preparation for the interview. And I mean, you say brutally honest, and brutally honest is absolutely what it is. I mean, listeners to the show are familiar with how kind of unflinching I am about all the stuff that I go through as a trans person and all the things that I deal with. So I think they're at least accustomed to that idea of, someone being just totally out there with everything. So why don't you kind of dig a little bit more into, so you mentioned Crohn's before. I would guess there probably aren't there are probably some people out there who don't exactly know what that means. Can you kind of go over that for us?
Absolutely. So I usually start this off by sort of explaining what an autoimmune disorder is. An autoimmune disorder is a group of disorders in which the body, for whatever reason, gets confused about who the enemy is and starts attacking itself. So the one most people are most common with, or most familiar with, is arthritis, or specifically rheumatoid arthritis, in which the antibodies attack your joints and causes them to swell and things of that nature. So Crohn's disease is an autoimmune disorder of that nature, except instead of attacking your joints, it attacks primarily your digestive system. And it can hit anywhere from your mouth all the way down to your anus, but it's more commonly presented in the large intestine and colon region. And it can cause a variety of symptoms from excessive bathroom usage or diarrhea, vomiting, nausea, extreme pain. Interestingly enough, it can also cause a variety of unexpected symptoms, like it can cause your joints to swell, not exactly in the same way that they would, say, with arthritis, but sort of, in my case, I get a lot of fluid retention around my ankles when I'm having a flare-up, and so it'll look like I have a baseball attached to my leg. So it's a variety of symptoms like that. And sometimes it can attack so badly that you lose all ability to digest food. And sometimes you need surgery basically to repair the damaged tissue. And in some cases, you can lose almost your entire digestive tract to the disease, at which point you will be given either some kind of portable nutrition or will have to have a colostomy bag. I've been lucky in that I haven't reached that point yet.
A lot of the book is talking about just what a journey it was to even get the diagnosis in the first place. I know that was kind of surprising for me as a person who I've had kind of relatively little interaction with, with the medical system in that way. I mean, I've had, token like tiny little problems here and there, but I don't think, I've never been through the experience of actually having a condition like that, that some people would consider invisible or something like. So can you kind of talk through what that was like?
Well, I mean, up until that point, I was mostly like everybody else, which was the same sort of thing. I had, small little concerns that I dealt with up until that point. But at the same time, there was this long thread throughout my history of interacting with doctors and not being properly believed. And it actually started with me when I was about 8 years old, and my family moved to St. Catharines. And we started seeing this doctor who, for whatever reason, just instantly decided that I was a hypochondriac. Which at 8 years old, and it ended up actually being interesting because, we had to a couple times force her into getting me referrals for things. Like when I had asthma, for a long time, she just kept insisting it was a cold. So my parents kept giving me cough syrup, and I kept bringing it back up because I was actually having an asthma attack. I wasn't having a cold, so obviously cold syrups weren't going to be doing anything for me. So she finally, under duress, gave me a referral to an allergist, and the allergist and pulmonary doctors basically took one look at me, and they're like, "You have asthma. You've been having asthma attacks."
Yeah, and kind of compounding the problem throughout this process, your parents were pretty much on your doctor's side, right? Like they believed your doctor over you, right?
And part of it, and I realize now that part of it, I felt really ill very often as a child, but I had a really weird response, which I found out years later runs in my family, which is that I could be really sick and I won't have any fever whatsoever. So I could have the flu, I could have whatever, but my parents usually, their first response when I said I was feeling ill was to take my temperature, and if I didn't have a fever, then clearly I wasn't really sick.
Right.
So I figured out pretty early how to game the system. And I started rubbing the tip of the thermometer with my tongue, knowing that the friction would actually create heat. And so when I didn't use it constantly, but when I knew that I was feeling really, really sick, but my thermometer wasn't cooperating with me, I would do that. And one of these times my parents actually kind of caught me doing it. And so rather than thinking, gee, why is this girl, causing her tongue to bleed? in order to convince us that she's sick. The assumption was clearly she is a hypochondriac or she just wants to miss school. And to a certain point, I even believed it as well. For a long time, I always thought that I was overreacting. And that was another thing. My parents had a tendency to tell me that I tended to overreact about a lot of things. So when I was feeling constantly nauseous or when I was having these weird pains that were happening in my stomach, I just wouldn't say anything. I figured it was just a normal part of what everybody went through. I remember at one point I actually just thought it was me ovulating because my parents said that a sharp pain once per month was, just a sign of ovulation. But it also created the sort of strangely adversarial system where from a young age, I knew that I couldn't count on doctors to trust me. That changed actually when we changed doctors, and the new doctor really, really liked me because I was obsessed with medicine and I kept asking him questions about what it was like to be a doctor. And so he would start sort of going out of his way to, talk things over with me or whatnot. But he was also fairly young, and he didn't necessarily know how to deal with a variety of the symptoms that I was having, the joint pain that was coming up. And my mother was coming with me and basically providing a really obvious answer. Well, clearly her joints hurt because she's overweight. What's worth noting is that that's a really common thing people experience, is that a lot of chronic symptoms will basically be blamed on weight rather than looking at the fact that weight can actually be a symptom rather than a cause. But what was also sort of going along with that is most of the disorders that I have, they're what is called zebra diagnoses. Now what that is one of the adages that most medical students get taught within their first year of university or their first year of medical school is, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. And so in most cases, doctors will basically, and it's basically going in with Occam's razor, which is basically the simplest explanation is probably the right one.
Right.
And in maybe 90% of cases, that's absolutely true. And it's good for, say, general practitioners who are going to be dealing with children, who are going to be dealing with, occasionally mothers who are a little overly concerned about things going on with their children, to keep a level head and be able to say that, no, it's probably actually something very simple. But when you exist as part of that 10%, that ends up backfiring because rather than looking at it going, okay, we've tested everything that's likely to be the case, let's look at other examples, they just keep trying to find ways to make the easy answer fit.
Right.
I don't know if that was very clear, but
no, that makes perfect sense. Actually, that's because when you said zebra diagnoses, I was like, "What the hell? What are you talking?" and then as soon as you said, look for horses, not zebras, I was like, "Oh, I think I know where this is going." Mm-hmm. In the in the journey to get your diagnosis, there's one story in particular from the book that really, really stuck out at me, and I seriously I had to set the book down for just a second and like come on guys, really. And there's the story of where you actually had to point out things on your X-ray to your doctor that your doctor either didn't see or was ignoring.
Oh wow.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's because they were going into it with an assumption of she's panicking because her leg hurts. She must have gone to WebMD and decided that it was cancer. And his first answer to me was, well, it's not cancer. And I remember sitting there thinking, I didn't think it was.
Right.
At no point did cancer go through my mind. What I thought it was is, possible blood clot, possible fracture that I couldn't see, or something going wrong with my arthritis. I from a very early point knew that this was probably my arthritis, but it's just that nobody was taking it seriously. It seemed like, oh, well, you have arthritis. What do you expect? You're going to be in pain. But what they didn't seem to realize, and I think a part of this had to do with my age and my gender in particular, they were looking at it and they were thinking, oh, the pain can't be as bad as she's describing. She's too young. She's too female. Girls, are weak or whatever. And if you remember, later on in the book, I talk about the reaction of a female doctor when she saw my x-rays.
Yeah.
And she looked at it going, you should have passed out every time you were taking a step, mm-hmm. which, for me was really entertaining because I remember thinking back to how many doctors were thinking that I was really just overreacting or thinking that it was something overwhelming. And I think people forget that doctors are human enough that they have the same kinds of biases as everybody else. And those biases will inform of what they see. There's that famous experiment, where they have those students passing around a basketball and they tell you to count how many times it was passed or whatever, or they don't tell you anything. And then at the end of the clip, they say, okay, who here saw the gorilla?
Right, yeah,
and
I remember that.
Everybody's like, what gorilla? What are you talking about? And I think it's the same kind of thing. It's if you have an expectation of what you expect to see, that's what you're going to see, So when a doctor's going in and he's pretty sure that I'm just overreacting and that I'm just panicking for no reason, then he's not really going to look closely to see the minute differences that someone who's looking, say, for arthritis or for an explanation is going to look for. He was looking for a reason to get me out of there. I was looking for a reason to explain why I was in pain.
Right, and so a nurse had actually taken you aside to show you your x-ray, like, oh yeah, here's the problem, because if memory serves it, you've been waiting so long to get with the doctor, and the nurse was like, hey, here's what's going on, and then when you got back to the doctor was like, oh yeah, so you're good, no problems here, and you're like, dude, hang on a second, like.
Yeah, and what that nurse did, actually, if anybody actually found out what she had done, she could have gotten in a lot of trouble. Nurses are not allowed to diagnose, and they're not allowed to discuss those kinds of things with patients, because theoretically they're not trained in it. That being said, nurses who've been around a long time tend to actually know better than doctors even, A, when a patient is faking, but B, when to look for sort of the really subtle things. They learn how to read the x-rays. They learn, which medications treat what. In that sort of situation, let's say the nurse told me something, and then I decided to sue the hospital for doing something wrong. Well, I could sue them basically for the nurse telling me what she did because she's not trained in doing that. So technically speaking, the hospital's not liable if she gives me a misdiagnosis or whatever. But she took a risk because she basically could tell that I was freaking out. I mean, for me, what had been going on by that point is I'd been walking on a leg that felt like it was shattering beneath me every time I was taking a step. I went from being perfectly mobile to barely being able to move, and basically even in sleep experiencing constant severe pain. And when she looked at me, she was just like, this isn't someone who's overreacting. We need to find a reason. And I'd also been trying to help some of the other patients despite that. Like, I remember while I was sitting there was a man who had hurt his back and had been trying to sit on these hard chairs. And when he tried to lay down on the floor because it was more comfortable, they actually said that he wasn't allowed to do that and forced him to sit in the chair again. So I remember going and trying to convince the nurses to at least bring out like an empty gurney or something so that he could lie down, because it's not, it's not fair to someone who's hurt their back to keep them in that really uncomfortable position. And so for all I know, she also just took me aside just to get me to stop talking.
Right.
But
troublemaker.
I choose to assume more decent motivations for that particular nurse. But yeah, so she took me aside and she showed me my x-rays. And I mean, looking at the x-rays, I'd like I mentioned at the time, I was obsessed with being a doctor. And so for me, looking at x-rays and looking at pictures of bones was something completely reasonable for me to be doing all the time. And so when I looked at my femur, like, I could tell things didn't look right. Like, I'm pretty sure bones aren't supposed to look jagged.
Right.
And that's exactly what was going on. And yeah, I mean, sure enough, looking at the pictures, you could see that it was, it had at least half the cartilage that the other joint had. So, I mean, for me, that stood out. But for the doctor who was basically looking to what he thought was comfort a patient who was worried about cancer, he didn't bother looking for anything other than the obvious signs.
Today in school, I learned a lot. In chemistry, I learned that no one likes me. In English, I learned that I'm disgusting. And in physics, I learned that I'm a loser.
Today in school, I learned that I'm ugly and useless. And in gym, I learned that I'm pathetic and a joke. In history, I learned that I'm trash.
Today in school, I learned that I have no friends. In English, I learned that I make people sick. And at lunch, I learned that I sit on my own because I smell. In chemistry, I learned that no one likes me.
In biology, I learned that I'm fat and stupid. And in math, I learned that I'm trash.
The only thing I didn't learn in school today.
The only thing I didn't learn today.
The only thing I didn't learn
is why no one ever helps.
Kids witness bullying every day. They want to help, but they don't know how. Teach them how to stop bullying and be more than a bystander at stopbullying.gov.
I've struggled with confidence throughout my life, and I've struggled with shame and internalized transphobia and internalized racism and internalized classism. And so I have all that stuff, but there was something in me believed I had something special. Telling the truth to myself about myself is awesome because it's just a relief, because I don't have to try to be something I'm not. I can just be. Who you are authentically is all right. The shame is what kills you. Believing that you are unworthy of love and belonging, that who you are authentically is a sin or is wrong, is deadly. Who you are is beautiful and amazing. It's important with all of the messages that might tell you otherwise, that you have that in yourself to say that I am beautiful, I'm smart, and I'm amazing.
And so, what kind of time frame are we talking about between the time that something was very obviously wrong to the time where you actually got a diagnosis and figured out exactly what was wrong?
Okay, so August of 2006 was when I basically started experiencing more and more severe pain, and when I quit my job at the summer camp to go home. By the time I got back to school, I was limping pretty obviously. So I'd been dealing with that for about a month, but I was waiting until I got back to Ottawa so that I could talk to my rheumatologist at the time. And I remember that I went to the walk-in clinic the day before because I was convinced that I must have sprained something or dislocated my hip slightly or whatever. And I remember that doctor just said, well, you're seeing your rheumatologist tomorrow. It's clearly your arthritis. Just go deal with him. And then the rheumatologist said, oh, well, maybe you sprained something. Here's a prescription for a cane. And here's new pain meds you can be on. But, they never even took any x-rays or anything. It was just assumed, let's look for the most reasonable explanation for why a 19-year-old girl's hip is hurting. So we could say that it started around August, September, and I finally got a full of 2006, and I finally got a complete answer to what was going on June, July of 2007. So it took nearly a full year.
Wow.
It went from I was limping and I felt very sore when I was moving from a sitting to a standing position or vice versa, to in something like February, April, having to drop my classes because I couldn't even walk with a cane. At that point, when I dragged myself to the hospital, I basically crawled up the stairs because I couldn't support myself with my feet. And when I went home with my parents, anytime I wanted to go out, my parents would rent a wheelchair for me so that I could be pulled around because I did not have the physical strength or ability to hold myself up anymore. So I went from somebody who could walk to somebody who was in a wheelchair.
And so talk me through, and again, obviously, if we run up against any boundaries, feel free to push back. I don't want to, have
Absolutely.
to, talk about anything that's, that's beyond what you want to talk about. But talk me through what that does to you because, I have very minor medical issues in comparison that I'm having trouble getting fixed. And this is obviously something that's so much greater than that. And I just know the frustration that I'm going through with my relatively minor problems in comparison. Just if you could kind of talk to me, what does that do to a person over time, having to deal with so often, people not believing you or, people not knowing what's going on. And all the while you're sitting there you obviously know your experience, something's going on.
Well, What's also worth noting here is that I came from a background of psychological and emotional abuse as well. So, I mean, the idea of not being believed, something I'd been dealing with for a really long time. So, to a certain extent, I didn't find it as strange as I think somebody who didn't have that background would have.
Gotcha.
So, for a long time, I blamed myself. Like, I thought that it's my fault I'm not explaining it well enough. It's my fault I'm overreacting. Or maybe I'm doing something wrong that's causing this, and the doctors basically don't know how to tell me that this is all my fault. Maybe I'm gaining too much weight, whatever. So I basically kept looking for reasons to blame myself. And then when I finally had to give up and go back home, my thought was, oh my God, I'm a failure. Because I figured, one of the tenets of adulthood is you take care of yourself and you take care of problems on your own. And I remember that for me, trying to figure out what was going on with me kind of felt like a way to prove to my family that I was actually an adult and that they could trust me and they could start treating me like an adult. Because, poor little naive me thought that that's what needed to be done to have my parents take me seriously, not realizing that it was just never going to happen, So when I had to go home, I really felt like a failure, and I went instantly into a very deep depression. And that's another thing. A lot of people don't realize how often there is a correlation between extreme disability of that kind and not getting answers and depression. Because it's bad enough being in constant pain when you know what's causing it. But when you're in constant pain and you don't know what's causing it, there's a big part of you that wants to blame yourself for it. And as long as you don't have an answer, it's your fault.
Yeah, well, and I imagine, the prospect of not knowing, when or if it's going to end, I'm sure plays a lot into that too.
There's definitely that, like not knowing if it's going to end. I mean, I'm facing that prospect right now as well, right? I mean, as somebody who has Crohn's that hasn't been responding enough to medication to go into remission, I very much have to face the fact that I'm going to feel like this probably for the rest of my life. And I mean, that can be really daunting. If you think of someone who's, going to be turning 30 next year, I'm still fairly young. I could potentially have another 60, 70 years of life. And looking at that and thinking, oh my God, 60, 70 years of pain just sounds a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
And there are times, when you catch yourself sort of thinking, like, is it worth it? Is it maybe not easier to just end it now and have it not continue? And I think, strangely enough, this is one area in which being an atheist is actually super positive for me, because I know deep in my heart that there is no after.
Right.
So while, ending it is still potentially an option, I'm not looking at it necessarily the way some people would look at it, the start of a new adventure or the chance to move on to the afterlife. Mm-hmm. For me, this is it. So when I'm out, I'm out.
Yeah, well, and so yeah, absolutely. And so you bring up being an atheist. So let's talk about that dimension of things, because and I have to imagine that this is a common experience for anyone who has anyone who experiences illness of any kind, I think, has this pushed on them, but especially people with chronic illness, the woo and the pseudoscience and the healing crystals and chakras and all that kind of stuff. Can you kind of talk about your experience with all of that?
It started really early. Like, I don't think I even realized how early it started as writing the book. It's funny because even now that it's been published and sent out, I keep having these moments where I stop and I think, oh wait, I should have included that anecdote, or
right.
I just remembered this part of things. And like, I remember at one point while I was dealing with my parents calling me and telling me that this could all be because I eat too many tomatoes, because they had found a website that was talking about foods that cause worse inflammation and arthritis. And so, because we were pretty sure this was my arthritis, which, I mean, what's hilarious is for the entire year, we were right about what was causing it. It wasn't so much getting the right diagnosis so much as it was getting the right treatment. Because if you'll remember from the book, I got diagnosed with the type of arthritis that was causing this about a year before everything started.
Right.
Which is, I mean, to me, it still just continues to be hilarious. I got the diagnosis a year before it really started happening. And somehow I still managed to not get treated. But So they had read up that certain foods can cause inflammation, and one of them was tomatoes, and I had always been obsessed with tomatoes. So my parents were like, "Oh, you must have, caused this to yourself by eating too many tomatoes." And I was just like, "I don't think so. I'm pretty sure that's not a thing." So then there was, the faith healer back when I was working for my mom while I was dealing with the leg issue, which was really weird. And I realized several years later was technically kind of sexual assault, which is really messed up. For those people who haven't read the book yet, I talk about a time where a faith healer basically put his hand on my ass and on my crotch and started rubbing back and forth to try to, heal my hip. And I'm not going to spoil it just because I feel like more people need to read that scene to really get the full appreciation for how messed up it was, because my mother was there, and this was not we didn't go seeking this guy. He was there for an unrelated reason. What I think a lot of people don't expect is how much completely rational people, and even people with a scientific background, because this was in my second year of biomedical sciences, can still be taken in by things. I remember I was looking on the internet for just anything that could help me with the pain. And I remember at one point coming across someone talking about how hyperbaric chambers can help. And how apparently the pressurized environments can cause a reduction in the swelling, which causes a reduction in the pain. And so I went on the internet and I tried to find somebody who had a hyperbaric chamber in the city that I was in. And it was attached to a naturopathy acupuncture clinic that also had a guy who made, what are those shoe inserts called? What are they called? But anyway, the things that you put in your... Yes, orthotics.
Yes.
So
I knew a thing.
The one actual reasonable thing in that one office, orthotics.
Right.
So I went in for a consultation with one of their doctors, and I'm doing scare quotes around the words doctors here. And he took a look at me, and he, instead of hyperbaric chamber, recommended that I get acupuncture with electrode therapy, which in my mind, I never actually got to see what they were putting in my back, but in my mind, I always just imagined myself being hooked up like Frankenstein, with these needles in my back and them attaching like wires and going. And you get desperate for some kind of answer, and you can be dragged into it just simply because if doctors aren't giving you a solution, and if they're even actively ignoring you, then you have to go look somewhere else for answers. And I think that's how a lot of people get involved in that kind of stuff. The other side of the things, of course, being sometimes doctors are helping you, but the stuff they're helping you with makes you feel even worse. And so you look for another answer just because you don't want to take the chemo anymore. So I think that more people need to be aware that when it comes to things like woo, when it comes to that kind of stuff, it's not about rationality. It's not about, it's not even about scientific background. It's very much about desperation and about just desperately needing an answer. Because the uncertainty is almost worse than the pain.
Yeah, I've had those conversations with other atheists a lot, and sometimes it gets really frustrating because, obviously we know that the anti-vax movement, it's pseudoscience, it's dangerous, it's based on bad information, but, at the same time, I just think to myself, I'm not a parent, but I can kind of put myself in that place and just think there's something wrong with my kids. The medical establishment doesn't have an answer. These people claim to have an answer. So, I can see how easily that might lead down that path, even for a person who is otherwise a perfectly rational and critical thinking person.
Well, in the case of anti-vaxxers, and I'm guessing that the something wrong with my child is autism, because that's usually what anti-vaxxers point at. Right. I think it's also a certain measure of not wanting to look too closely of what having an autistic child means in terms of yourself, because autism, we're seeing more and more right now that it is a genetic thing, right? So you have to, look at it and think, oh my God, this is my fault. And parents don't want to face that, right? They don't want to look at a child who's maybe having a hard time or struggling and say, oh my God, I caused this because of something I have no control over, right?
Right.
My gene.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Yeah.
But an even greater thing is just there's so much ableism in our society that, we look at something like autism, and there's people out there who apparently think that deaf is better than autism. As somebody who is likely on the spectrum myself, I disagree.
Well, right, and many of my friends who are on, many of my friends who are on the spectrum would also disagree, and I would disagree because they're wonderful people.
And I think for a lot of people, when they look at autism, definitely part of what's to blame for this is organizations like Autism Speaks, who, under the guise of raising awareness, actually just basically create stereotypes about what autism is, and also don't look sort of beneath the answers. There's also the other side of things that a lot of parents don't necessarily want to take the time and the responsibility to be good disability parents. And so instead what they do is they look at, is they try to force their children to act like everybody else rather than working with their children and creating a solution for both of them. So for example, in the case of certain autistic children, it can cause certain children to be nonverbal, and rather than learning how to read your children's signs or whatever, or going the extra mile and maybe learning sign language so that they have an option for nonverbalness, they would rather just scream at their child for failing.
Right.
And
I feel like it, I feel like it has a lot to do with the expectations that parents can have for their kids. And, I always try to be super, super careful when I make comparisons between different types of experience, because I obviously don't want to be appropriative of people's experience. But when I hear that, I also hear, parents having trouble accepting their trans kids because whatever it was, they had a very specific vision for who they want their kid to be. Mm-hmm. And because their kid is not that thing in one way or another, and obviously, there are different spectrums of experience, whether we're talking about disability or even just somebody choosing it. I mean, it can be something as innocuous as a child choosing a different career path than their parents wanted them to, all the way up to these other things. So, I think there's some kind of overlap there.
There definitely is. And I get to, I am sort of lucky in this respect that because my own life exists along several of these axes. I'm not straight. I'm not monogamous, which my parents don't know about. Yes, I'm white, but I'm the daughter of immigrants, and where English wasn't my first language. Which is not to say that the immigrant experience is the same as the experience of people of color. I'm in no way trying to compare my experiences to that. What I meant by that is that the xenophobia that informs parts of racism also informs some of our reactions to immigrants, and that while I was an immigrant, I was also a white immigrant, so I had it much easier than, say, a non-white or a person of color immigrant. Just to make that clear, I'm not trying to appropriate the race experience of people of color. But what I meant by that is that because of the fact that I do sort of fall outside the norm along several spectrums, I can definitely see how a lot of it is basically a parent's reaction to anything that makes their children, and then again, I'm going to use scare quotes here around the words, normal, not normal.
Right.
Even if you look at, what parents, when they talk about when they're pregnant, a lot of times they're like, oh, so are you hoping for a boy or a girl? Oh, I just hope they're healthy. But what they really mean is, I just hope that they're normal.
Right.
Normal and exceptional. Well, and it's funny, too, because not actually normal. Normal and exceptional is what they want them. Super normal.
Right. Super normal.
Normal in every way.
Along where, you're good at sports, or, you're good at things that you're allowed to be good at. You deviate in ways that are allowed to deviate.
Right.
But then there's the rest of us who don't deviate along those lines, who deviate along different ones. Maybe we're not healthy. Maybe we're not straight. Maybe we're not the same gender that we were assigned at birth. Maybe we're not, all these different things. And now all of a sudden parents have to face the fact that their children are not normal. So rather than face the fact that now they have to look at their own bigotry and their own biases, they're instead looking at it as, no, this is clearly my child's fault. This is not my fault. Therefore, I will blame them because you chose to be trans, or you chose to be sick, or you chose to be gay. And if I blame you for your choice, I don't have to blame myself for creating a world in which this choice is a bad thing, or which this existence is a bad thing.
Right. And you kind of touched on, because you mentioned the word immigrant earlier, and something that it took me a second to realize in the book is that your experiences with the healthcare system are in Canada, right? And yes. I feel like there are so many of us in the U.S. who have a very idealized view of what healthcare is outside of the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of ways in which being in Canada is definitely a privilege. Like, I mean, I could not have gone to the ER and to all those doctor's appointments if I'd had to pay for it myself. Mm-hmm. Which actually means that if I had lived in the U.S., I probably still wouldn't have a diagnosis. I probably would be dead by now. Unless I ended up in the hospital in such a bad state, they finally figured out what was wrong with me, and then I'd basically be thousands and thousands of dollars in debt, in which case I probably wouldn't be alive, mainly because I'd have no choice just to do what I considered doing before.
Right.
Which is the sort of, yeah. So, I mean, there is definitely sort of that privileged side of things, but on the other side, I probably wouldn't have spent that many hours in an ER in the U.S., for example, unless I went specifically to a free clinic. Or, you know, I might have found, or because my parents were sort of better off, I might have been sent to doctors who would have potentially been more motivated to listen because we were paying them. On the other side of things, there are still a lot of things wrong with the Canadian system, such as we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough nurses. This creates long waiting times. Also, it's not as free as people might think, but the costs are sort of sideways costs. Like, all the parking lots at hospitals are pay parking lots. So if you're driving, you know, you better have the money to pay for it. You know, if you're taking the bus stop still creates a long enough walk, so you better be mobile enough to be able to walk the rest of the way to the ER or to walk the rest of the way to the hospital. So there are still very, very real barriers to getting medical care. It's just that it's not specifically having to pay to see your doctor.
Gotcha. Yeah, and there's some important nuance there. That's kind of why I wanted to bring it up, because I feel like people have a very idealized view of healthcare outside the U.S. And obviously the U.S. has a myriad of ridiculous healthcare problems, with kind of a few glimmers of, well, at least there's this kind of thing. So I think that's kind of an important conversation to have, because I think pretty much any time when we have a conversation about anything, basically there's usually a lot more nuance than is generally spoken about in the conversation.
Callie, before you mentioned when you were talking about the anti-vax parents who the doctors don't know what's wrong with their child, and then, you know, some faith healer or somebody comes over and says, you know, I have the answer, and they are just so desperate to find an answer. I feel like that ties in a lot with religion for sure, because, you know, there are so many people that even if they're maybe kind of wishy-washy on their religion or pretty secular, you know, whenever they get into like an accident or have some kind of illness or injury or are diagnosed with some chronic illness, you know, they feel desperate and they turn to Jesus or turn to, you know, whatever religion it might be for comfort. Was that something that you experienced at all, or was that maybe something that people tried to pressure you into, even if you weren't quite going that way?
Well, there's sort of interesting two sides of things, because I actually started off really religious. I was very involved with the Catholic Church. And even though I questioned a lot of things from a young age, the existence of God was not usually one of them. More specifically, I'd question what God actually was, as opposed to whether or not he existed or she existed. So, like, I remember at one point, my theory was that none of the religions had God right, and that all of them were just basically God presenting himself in a different mask to make himself easier to understand by humans.
Unitarian.
Oh, I didn't actually know that was the Unitarian idea. I remember telling that to my father, and I remember my father being like, that sounds like it could be reasonable. However, you're also Catholic, and the canon of the church says that this is the one true faith. So, you know, just remember that. And I'm like, oh, God. You know, and what's another sort of like one of the major things that happened when I developed the flare is that I lost a lot of weight really, really quickly. And there was a part of me that was wondering whether I had caused this because I had spent so many years praying to God to help me lose weight.
Oh.
And then I was wondering if I should have been more specific about how that was to be accomplished.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was kind of. Am I allowed to swear?
Oh, we try to keep it PG-13, but if
okay. So it was kind of a mind bleep.
Got it.
In that sort of sense, that I was losing a lot of weight, and it turned out that I was Crohn's, and I thought I might have caused it myself. But there's sort of the other side of things, which is that even when you have a diagnosis, there's still a lot of unanswered questions, and that's something where I could very much see predatory religions coming in to explain. And I mean, part of that is, for example, most of my disorders are genetic disorders, but the gene can, whether or not you develop the condition, seems to be fairly arbitrary. Like, it starts with, say, psoriasis, and almost everyone, like a lot of people have psoriasis, but only 10% of them end up with psoriatic arthritis. So the question is, what makes me be part of the 10%? And then of the people who have that gene, some others develop Crohn's disease. Well, okay, what makes me that percentage of people who develops that? What did I do to deserve that, There's that sort of question. And that's not necessarily one that we are able to answer right now. Like, there's no one out there who can tell me why I developed Crohn's and my sister didn't. Mm-hmm. Other than saying, well, she has the gene, but it's not activated, and you have the gene and it's not activated. Or other way around, sorry.
Right.
And so where religion likes to step in is it likes to say that it has answers to the unanswerable. So you'll have some religions that say, well, God is giving you this because you need to learn the meaning of suffering. I mean, even disability, even when you do have answers as to what caused it, there's a lot of unanswered questions that still remain, and that those kinds of questions end up being really good access points for all sorts of types of predatory organizations. Be it a religious one, that comes in and says, "Oh, you have this because you saw their life," or "You have this because you're being punished for something your family did," or a variety of other reasons. You've done something for which God thinks you need to atone, and therefore you're sick, or God is teaching you a lesson, or that everything happens for a reason. Could someone please explain to me what reason somebody could possibly have that involves my own body trying to digest itself?
Right.
Sin. I guess all the sin.
Yeah, sin.
Right?
That's what it is.
But I want to know, God has a plan, and all this different stuff. And I really don't want to know what kind of plan he has that involves that. Because I've been watching a lot of Criminal Minds, and I'm basically thinking that God is a sociopath.
Well, that's not out of the question.
What's up, everyone? My name is Jamie, and I am with an organization called A Voice for the Innocent. We are a community of support for people who are affected by sexual violence. We are super excited to announce that we have partnered with the Vans Warped Tour to launch the Save Our Scene campaign. It's an initiative to reduce sex crimes in the music industry, and we've been working tirelessly to make sure it's as powerful as it can be. We've written an in-depth training for the bands on the tour to help them better understand the scope of the problem and learn how they can be part of the solution. We've done hours upon hours of research to compile every last resource we can find for people who have experienced sexual violence. We then took these resources, sorted them by location, and created state-specific free literature to hand out to music fans at every date of Warped. On top of that, we will be reaching out to people at every stop to let them know that we are another resource for them, and if they have a story to tell, we have a place where people will listen. This is, quite frankly, the largest project we have ever taken on, and we are extremely excited to have this opportunity, but we need your help. Sending 2 people on tour costs money, not to mention the cost of printing literature for every date on top of all the materials we will need to make our campaign have the largest impact possible. This includes a tent, merchandise bins, dollies, and all the other odds and ends that come with touring and implementing this campaign. We are asking for your donations. Anything you can give will get us closer to our goal of reaching as many people on the tour as possible. To donate or to learn more, visit saveourscene.org. Thank you to everyone who is able to help us in this endeavor. And as always, thank you so much to those of you who have already helped us along the way. Hopefully we will see you out at Warped Tour.
Hey friends, I wanted to let you know about something cool that listeners of the show may be interested in. A good friend of mine is doing a fundraiser for an organization called the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network seeks to advance the principles of the disability rights movement with regard to autism. ASAN believes the goal of autism advocacy should be a world in which autistic people enjoy the same access, rights, and opportunities as all other citizens. They work to empower autistic people across the world to take control of their own lives and the future of their common community, and seek to organize the autistic community to ensure their voices are heard in the national conversation about them. Their motto is "Nothing about us without us," which is something I can totally sympathize with, given the lack of trans representation in so much that affects our community. To learn more about the fundraiser and to contribute, jump on Facebook and search for a group called Autism Acceptance Month Fundraiser. It's an awesome cause, and I hope you'll check it out and contribute if you're able. Thanks! Back to all of the issues that you had, getting a diagnosis and all of that kind of stuff. What I'm curious about, and you kind of touched on this at the very beginning, what is your sense of how common that experience is?
There is a certain bias in my answer because a significant portion of my friends are people who have disabilities because they find me through my writing. So I am collecting sort of evidence from a very specific sample. But that being said, I have found that the experiences that I explain in my book are pretty common across the board. The actual specific details might not be the same, but the actual experiences described, the general sort of dealing with more severe consequences because they weren't believed, having their weight blamed, a lot of those kinds of things end up being very frighteningly common. What I've also found, though, that there is a gender bias along those lines in that my female presenting friends get diagnosed a lot later than my male presenting friends. And one of the things that I see in that is, for example, that of the people that I know with Crohn's, the majority, by a huge margin, of the people who I know who have managed to go into remission have been men. And the only reasoning I can think of for that is, well, no, I mean, there are other reasons, but the major one is that they get diagnosed a lot earlier in their disease than a lot of women do. Well, and I do think, if memory serves, I'd have to search for it, and if I can find it, I'll put it in the show notes. But if memory serves, there is actually some pretty strong statistical evidence for that. That women's pain is not taken as seriously as men's pain is. Yep. One actually very frightening study found that people of color in particular were given significantly less painkillers for chronic pain conditions than white people were, and that a distressingly large percentage of medical students still operated under the assumption that people of color experience less pain, or rather feel pain less.
Yeah, I think I saw that recently, actually.
Yeah, there's one article going around right now talking about the fact that something like 10% of a medical school class at a very well-respected institution believed that people of color feel pain less than white people. And we're talking like 10%. That's not an insignificant percentage. Right. And also that a lot of people tend to think that women exaggerate pain or that women feel pain more intensely than men do. Therefore, a 10 on a woman's pain scale is, in doctors' minds, more equivalent to a 5 on a men's pain scale. So when a man comes in complaining of, and I'm saying man, but I mean presenting male, presenting female, because, I mean,
Sure, I know what you mean.
You know, because not everyone who presents male is male.
Right.
But yeah, so that, you know, statistically, they're going to be taken seriously a lot earlier in the disease process. With something like Crohn's, for example, men are more likely to get tested as soon as they show that their iron is low, whereas women who have low iron tend to have it blamed on their menstrual cycle, which we now know is not a cause of iron deficiency anemia. But a lot of doctors still think it is.
Oh, God, that's so frustrating.
Just blame it on the period.
Well, and what's interesting is they found 30% of women who presented with low iron actually had a GI bleed.
Ooh.
So they were bleeding somewhere in their intestines. And I remember in high school several times testing as iron deficiency anemic, and every time I was just told, oh, that's normal for girls.
Wow.
And was prescribed iron, and that's it. And now I know that actually I had bleeding ulcers in my intestines.
Right. Ugh. So I think we've done a pretty good job covering, you know, that side of things. What I'd kind of like to turn to now is more what it's like to just sort of navigate life, you know, as a person with chronic illness and with a disability. And, you know, this is a topic that I think is getting more and more attention, and I think deservedly so. You know, it's a topic where, you know, it's my turn to be an ally, because I'm usually, you know, having the conversation around trans issues. I'm usually the one who is telling other people like how they can be better allies and that kind of thing. And you know, in this conversation, I'm obviously the ally because, you know, whatever medical problems I have are very small and very non-intrusive in comparison. So if you could kind of, I don't know, try to kind of just summarize, I guess, what your experience has been with what it's like to navigate society in that respect.
Well, I think the biggest thing is that I very much have found myself becoming more of an introvert. I used to be I've always been an ambivert in that I both gain energy from being around people, but I also lose some, and it really depends on the people I'm with. But I've been finding myself very much becoming more and more of an introvert in the last several years, and it is directly related to my illnesses and to how I navigate the world. And a part of it is that every trip to go out now is a lot more of an effort than it used to be. For example, say going over to spend the night at a friend's house, or basically to spend a couple of hours at a friend's house. You know, before I could, you know, just grab my keys and go. Now it's a matter of, okay, I'm going to be there for a couple hours, so I need to bring my pain meds. Oh, are they going to be okay with me smoking in their house? If they're not, okay, well, I need to figure out where I'm going to smoke when I go there. You know, does that mean that I have to wear extra clothing because it's really cold outside, or do I need an umbrella because it's raining? And so now, you know, every trip outside involves having to actually plan the same way as somebody might for, say, a longer trip, which in itself, you know, is exhausting because nobody likes packing. So I've been finding that my social interactions tend to be a lot more energizing if they take place in my own home, because I don't have to worry so much about having to pack everything that I need, about making sure that there's a comfortable seat for me to sit on. I think one of the most awkward things is going over to someone's house and they have like all this really gorgeous furniture that is horribly uncomfortable. Right. And like for most people, it's like, okay, you know, it's unpleasant, but it's not a big deal. But for me, it could very much mean that I am limping home. Because, you know, uncomfortable could mean, you know, that it's actually putting pressure in a really bad place.
Right.
Or going over to somebody's house for dinner and the only thing I can eat that's on the table is the mashed potatoes, you know, and they spend hours, you know, making this delicious meal and I can't eat any of it because it's something that sets off my Crohn's flare. So, I mean, one thing that a lot of my friends have started doing is, say, asking me about things that are of concern. When it comes to my Crohn's, I often find that it's easier for them to run their menu past me rather than me trying to tell them what I can and can't eat, because trying to remember everything that you can't eat on a moment's notice is kind of like
well, and it does kind of change from time to time, right? Like sometimes certain things are okay and sometimes they're not.
Yeah, like I can, if I'm not particularly flaring, I'm fine with sweet potato, but if I'm flaring, I can't touch it. It's sort of the same thing with different meals where, you know, they might hurt me slightly, but if I'm not particularly flaring, I'm not going to notice it. But if I'm in the middle of a flare, then it could do some serious damage. And I mean, that part's always awkward. The other thing is that I don't think a lot of people realize how much having a disability impacts your finances. I've never been as poor as I've been since I've become disabled. And part of that is because disability doesn't nearly pay enough. A part of that is because you get lower paying jobs when you're disabled. A part of that is because if you're working an hourly wage, then if you're giving up, then anytime you call in sick, you're losing money. But also a part of it has to do with the fact that it's expensive to be disabled. My pain medication that I take isn't covered by insurance, but I need to take it daily or else I'm in excruciating pain. So it can cost me up to $600 a month, but I'm living on a fixed income. So I have to try to find a way to make that $600 every month. So that can impact my ability to go out as well, because I don't always have the money to spend to go somewhere. So when it comes to sort of navigating with it, or specifically what other people can do to be helpful, there's a comfortable surface, running past their needs, but also talking to your friends about like, what is something that I can do to help you out? Because what'll help me might not be something that'll help somebody else, Like I could say, oh, I need to be able to sit on the couch. So, if you make sure that you save a spot on the couch for me, that'd be great. But for somebody else, they might need a chair because a couch is too soft for them. So, I mean, there's very little that I can say in terms of, here's a list that is guaranteed to always work for your disabled friends.
Right.
I can't even give you a list of what will always work for Crohn's people, because even there's going to be variation. But what I can say is one of the best things is be open, listen to your friends, let them know that you care about making it more comfortable with them, and listen to what they have to say. So if they tell you that they're okay, then, trust them. Sometimes a big annoyance can be getting pressured too often into trying to say something when there's literally nothing that you can say.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a huge aversion to talking about that kind of thing with people who are on the outside, people who don't experience that kind of thing, because I think a lot of people, it makes them uncomfortable, and therefore they assume that it makes everyone uncomfortable. So they're just like, well, we're just not going to talk about it.
Well, and I mean, sometimes people go to such efforts to not talk about your disability that they end up avoiding you because of the stress of not having to talk about your disability.
Right.
And so it ends up sort of backfiring, because it's like, I would have been perfectly fine to answer any questions you had. Or, you're totally welcome to remark on it, or that kind of thing. Like I have a friend who, one of the ways that she copes with my disability is she reminds me to medicate whenever she's over at my house. So like if she sees me and I'm not medicating, she'll be like, oh, do you need to medicate right now? And that's been actually great for me, because I'll often forget, or I'll feel uncomfortable smoking around other people. And so that's her way of letting me know that she's okay with it, but also her way of helping me with my disability by helping make sure that I'm not in pain. And I mean, at the same time, like there's a lot of people who, there's a lot of people who don't like talking about their disability. Like that's an important thing as well. There are people who do not like discussing it and who do not like any mention of it. But there's also other people who like being able to talk about it because it's such a major part of their lives. I mean, the way that there is not a single day in which I am not in some way impacted by my chronic illnesses.
Right.
It's a huge part of my life, and telling me that I can't talk about it is basically telling me that I can't talk about one of the biggest things in my life, one of the things that takes up the most amount of time. I think that another big thing that you can sort of do is, as somebody sort of who maybe isn't there as much with it, is also to really understand how exhausting it can be to be chronically ill. I'm pretty sure this makes like everybody sort of top 10 things you shouldn't do or things you should do for people with a disability. And one of them is not be upset with us when we have to cancel plans. We are too tired. And a lot of times, we'll get somebody who will be like, oh, I kind of don't want to hang out with you anymore because you're just always canceling on me. And you're, claiming it's because you're sick. But then, the next day you're like out doing something cool. And so I feel like you just don't like me and whatever. And it's just really, no, I actually am just sick on those days. I have no control over when I'm going to feel well and when I'm not going to feel well. I hate having to cancel plans on people, but sometimes I have no choice. So, if you have a friend, but don't stop inviting us to things either. It always seems to sort of be one or the other. Either people get upset at us for constantly canceling on them, or they think they'll be nice by not offering the invitation to begin with, and so we end up being completely isolated. So it sort of needs to be a balance. Still invite me to things, but also, keep in mind that I might have to cancel because of illness. Because
at that point, they're kind of taking the compassion thing a little too far and thinking like, well, if I invite them and they have to tell me no, then they feel bad, so I might as well just not. Mm-hmm.
And also be open to a change of plans. Like, a lot of times when I'm feeling terrible, having a friend saying, hey, how would you feel, if I came over and we could watch Netflix and I'll bring over a snack or I'll bring over pizza or something. And that's actually perfect because not only is it like low effort for me because we're just, hanging out and watching Netflix, but maybe you've offered to bring food and now I don't have to worry about making dinner. So I can devote more of my energy to hanging out with you than I would if I had to worry about, what I was going to do to take care of, that eating thing. Right. So there are ways to actually make it easier on people. I kind of entertained that Netflix and chill ended up being sort of a dating related thing because there's actually times when I want to invite people to literally Netflix and chill.
Right. We're actually going to be just like sitting around in the living room watching Netflix. I want to make that very clear.
I'm wondering how many of my friends are actually super disappointed because I told them, hey, you want to come over and watch Netflix, and they come over and I literally mean watching Netflix, and they were like, darn, like I thought I was getting lucky or something. No, I think most of my friends now know what I mean when I say that, but I imagine that somewhere out there's someone who's horribly disappointed.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk for a minute kind of about some of the stereotypes that surround disability. Like one of the things that you talk about in the book that I really appreciated because I felt like that was a bias that I had kind of had, was that, for example, if someone uses a wheelchair, they better use it 100% of the time or else they're faking it, like that kind of thing.
Well, that's a big one actually, is consistency, is people think that if there's something wrong with you, it has to be wrong with you all the time or it's not real, which is really awkward with things like Crohn's where there very much is fluctuation. Like I could go 3 weeks, without having any symptoms whatsoever. And then all of a sudden in those 3 weeks just have one day where I can't move anything. Or, I could be, or there's times when I have to use the wheelchair or I have to use an assistive device at a store, not because it has anything to do with my joints, but actually because of my Crohn's, because I would feel so tired that I wouldn't actually be able to finish my groceries just from my energy level. And by reducing having to walk, I heighten it that way. I think one of the things that impacts a lot of the stereotypes there, too, is when you're overweight. Very rarely will you see those kinds of pictures of, oh, look, a miracle in the alcohol aisle about somebody who's skinny.
Yeah.
A lot of times the assumption is that I'm using an assistive or mobility device because I'm so fat that I don't have the energy, like the physical energy because of fitness to walk that way. And so people will look at me and will just think like she's so fat she can't walk properly. Whereas in reality, no, I can walk just fine. It's just that at this moment my hip is killing me or I have no energy because I've just haven't been able to digest anything I've been eating for the last 2 weeks and my body is currently eating itself.
Right. Yeah. Another good one, and I've had this impulse too because I'm a person who likes to help, right? But I think what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of times the urge to help can be sort of overriding and taking someone's bodily autonomy away from them. Can you kind of talk about that for a minute?
Well, I mean, I've definitely had that where, and this is actually kind of a funny one because this is one a lot of people might not think of. I've had situations where I've made the decision it was going to be, a little unhealthy for me, like, say, having a drink. And people will be, so worried about what I'm doing. Like, are you sure you should be doing that? Aren't you worried that it's going to hurt your Crohn's? Didn't you say that this hurts your Crohn's? And they're asking me so many questions about whether I'm sure that I should be doing this thing that I realistically shouldn't be doing, that it ends up taking away the enjoyment of the thing that I'm doing.
Right.
So like maybe I decided to have a drink just this once because it's the kind of situation, like it's New Year's Eve and I wanted to have a glass of champagne because I like the taste of champagne, or because it's a barbecue and it just feels nice to have a cooler with other people. I drink maybe one glass of something every 2 months, maybe. I've definitely gone a year without drinking anything before because alcohol does hurt my Crohn's. But yeah, people will try to police you sometimes, and they're doing it because they care, because they don't want you to be in pain, or they don't, but at the same time, it's like, everybody makes decisions to do something that they're not supposed to do every once in a while, or do something unhealthy. It doesn't make me any different from anybody else.
Well, exactly. Cause in my mind, I'm thinking like, okay, well, like, there's no one more aware of your capabilities than you. So if you have decided that this is a thing that you're going to do, like, I mean, I might be like, you going to be okay? Yeah, I'm going to be okay. Okay, cool. Like, I would imagine that would be the end of it,
Yeah. No, but I've definitely had people who are like checking with me constantly. And then what's worse is if later on in the evening you do actually end up with some pain, and then they're just kind of looking at you like, see, I told you you weren't going to be okay. And it's just like, have you considered that the stress of you constantly asking me that is what's causing the pain right now?
Right. Or that you have made in your head, because you are an adult and capable of making your own decisions, that you've made the cost benefit analysis and decided that like, I know what this is probably going to do, but I have made the decision that for, this is a thing that I enjoy doing, so I'm going to do it once, even though I understand the consequences, because I'm an adult and this is what I want to do for right now. Like, I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to look at it too.
And actually, the example I should have given, rather than a drink, should have been actually a salad, because that's something that can be really bad for me. It can cause a lot of pain, but oh my God, do I miss salads. Like, for me, cheating on my diet is having a salad.
And so what about a salad hurts as far as that goes?
Leafy greens.
I gotcha.
Basically, when you have very swollen digestive tissue, it's good to avoid anything that's roughage. Gotcha. The name becomes very appropriate at that point.
Got it. Understood. And, one example that I had in mind, when bringing up the whole topic of, bodily autonomy and all that is, because my friend that I'd mentioned before, I've had lots of conversations with them about the topic, because it's something that I am completely ignorant of, and I like to do my best to try and be educated, Yeah, exactly. Pushing the wheelchair, grabbing somebody's wheelchair and pushing them without permission.
Yeah, I'm in a weird circumstance for that, because most of the times when I've been using a wheelchair, it was specifically one of the manual wheelchairs provided by things like hotels or things like malls. And those actually take a lot of effort to push by hand. And because I'm not a consistent wheelchair user, I don't have the physical upper body strength necessary for maintaining that constantly. So I actually do need someone to push my wheelchair.
Right.
That being said, pushing it when I don't want them to push it at that moment, like say I'm in the middle of looking something and they decide they want to go, so they grab my wheelchair and go. No. That's really infantilizing, and that's very unpleasant. In terms of other sort of bodily autonomy stuff, I'm trying to think, because there's definitely examples, but it's always like when you're put on the spot and you
right.
Well, can't think of it.
Well, the way that they explained it, and it made it make a lot of sense to me, and something that I hadn't thought about before is when someone is using a mobility aid of any kind, you should, generally speaking, think of that as an extension of that person's body.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely.
like no different than an arm or a leg or anything like that. So if you're going to touch or otherwise manipulate that thing, you need to have permission. Yeah. And you need to know that this is a person, you know, this is a thing a person wants or needs you to do before you even think about it.
And actually, that applies even if they're not currently using the mobility assistive device. I mention this because I have a friend who uses a walker, and when she's indoors, she doesn't necessarily need to use it because she's only walking very short distances, and she's unlikely to trip. But she needs it anytime she goes outside. And so she'll sometimes come to a restaurant or a party or something, and she'll put the walker in a very specific place, and then somebody will move it. But they'll move it without telling her. And so she'll come back to where she had parked her walker, and all of a sudden it's gone.
Right.
And she has no idea where it is. Or when I was using my cane, you know, I'll put my cane down somewhere and somebody will move it out of the way, but then I can't reach it and I'm unable to stand up because my cane is somewhere where I can't reach it. That's actually one that I hadn't thought of. So yeah, I mean, any kind of assistive device should be treated as a part of the person's body, regardless of whether they're using it at the time or not. And if you need to move it out of the way, because yes, sometimes the cane or the walker might be in the way, you've got to ask permission first.
Right, absolutely.
This also goes, say, for, and this actually also goes for assistive devices that are living, such as, say, service dogs.
Right.
Touching a service dog is very much like touching a part of that person's body at that point, because they are basically connected. And you could cause somebody to have a fatal accident as a result of touching their service dog or even talking to their service dog.
Right, because you're causing a distraction, and this
exactly.
You know, this dog's purpose is to have their attention 100% focused on whatever their purpose is for the person they're helping.
Exactly.
So yeah, the last thing you want to do is cause a distraction.
And like, there's definitely been times where like somebody decides to like throw a treat somewhere in order to see somebody's seeing eye dog, say, veer off trail sometimes to make someone fall. And people will actually do that. Also,
oh my God, that's so cruel.
If you have a pet and you see someone approaching you with a service dog, restrain your animal, because I have a friend who lost a service animal to somebody else's off-leash dog who attacked the service dog, and the service dog was unable to defend itself because it was currently in a harness. And basically, by the time the dog was given permission by the owner, because the owner couldn't see and didn't know what was going on, just all of a sudden he hears their dog yelp or whatever, finally figures out that it's another dog attacking and gives the command, like, you can ignore me, like, defend yourself. It was too late. The dog had been so viciously attacked that it had to be put down. And that person basically... And service dogs can cost, and especially seeing eye dogs, can cost thousands of dollars.
Well, yeah, and they take lots and lots of time to train, too.
I'm currently, Ontario is interesting because it lets you do something called owner training, which is basically that you can train your own service dog yourself. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm currently doing with the Chihuahua you heard earlier.
Yeah.
She's in the process of being trained to be my service dog. And, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of work to do it.
Yeah.
She has to go through basic obedience first. Like right now, we're just doing a normal PetSmart course because she's only 6 months old. Mm-hmm. You're not even allowed to start training them until they're 6 months old, but a lot of places will recommend until they're a year old, because when dogs go through their adolescent phase, they kind of become jerks.
Right.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Are you tired of being informed by all the information Callie is giving you?
You wish you had a podcast to listen to that didn't make you think about confusing things and difficult social issues. Waiting for Wrath, the beer-guzzling podcast you listen to when you're done being informed.
Hi, this is Trav Mamone of the By Any Means podcast. The By Any Means podcast is a weekly show where I interview guests about the intersections of social justice and humanism. Just go to www.byanymeans.com, that's by spelled B-I, to hear the podcast and read the blog. Because, hey, aren't we all a little bi-curious?
Hello, I'm Alan Cumming. Live Out Loud is calling on the LGBT community to help improve life for gay teens. Take what you know and gay it forward through the Homecoming Project, a chance to return to your old high school and share your story with LGBTQ youth. Your life experiences and wisdom can prove invaluable to teens who may be struggling with their own identities and paths in life. One day can make a lasting difference. Gay it forward with the Homecoming Project. Find us at liveoutloud.info to learn how you can get involved today.
So, we talked about this a little earlier, but can you think of, and obviously, the overarching concept of disability and chronic illness is a gigantic spectrum from things that have a minor impact in life to things that define you, that literally define your life. So obviously this is a broad topic, but just kind of speaking generally, if we're all trying, like, folks like us who are able-bodied and generally healthy, like, what are some things that we can do, that we can be aware of, that we can be more cognizant of, that will make things easier for folks?
Well, one of them is actually language, and I'll, for example, point to something that you did. You said able-bodied, and that basically equates disability with physical disability, which is very problematic for those of us who suffer from mental disabilities.
Fair.
Sorry, and I know you didn't mean it that way. And actually, one of the terms that we use now for people as sort of the opposite of disabled is abled.
Right. No, and that's fine. I want to be called out on things like those because when people say problematic things surrounding, queer trans issues, I'm usually not too shy about being like, hang on a second. so no, I definitely appreciate that.
So it's sort of that kind of idea is keep in mind that not all disabilities have to be physical, and not and also bear in mind that even that physical illnesses have mental components and mental illnesses have physical components. The dichotomy between the two is actually entirely false.
Right.
So bear in mind that it is ever-changing. So just because something is true today doesn't mean it's true tomorrow. I could be sick today and feel fine tomorrow. I could feel fine for the whole year and still be legitimately sick for that one day that I'm sick. Actually, here's an interesting one that came up today. On one of my YouTube videos, somebody left a comment, Crohn's causes you to lose. And that was the entirety of the comment, but it was pretty clear that they were either I was lying about my diagnosis because I was overweight, or that I was somehow failing my illness because I was overweight. And what that was ignoring was the fact that, yes, one of the initial symptoms of Crohn's can be weight loss, but once you start being able to digest food again, sometimes your body panics and thinks, oh my God, what if they start again? And so immediately starts storing everything as fat. Sometimes the only things you can digest when you're going through a period is sugar. So obviously that's going to get stored primarily as fat.
Right.
And a lot of the medications that we take for Crohn's disease causes weight gain. So there's no way to, by look, be able to tell whether or not somebody has a disability, regardless of what the disability is. Even something that seems like it should have a very obvious outside signal isn't going to necessarily have one.
Right. So when you see someone who has a handicapped placard on their car parking, in a spot, and you don't think they look like they're disabled, just stop. Don't do the thing that you think that you're going to do.
This is actually, and I'm actually going to give a pretty good example because this one actually comes up with me a lot, which is you don't look in pain.
Right.
And the thing is I deal with pain 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Yes, there might be moments, very few moments in between where the pain is low enough that it's practically not there, but realistically I'm going through pain constantly. And people have this expectation that they should be able to tell when I'm in pain. So last year I went in to get my wisdom teeth taken out, And they had me hooked up to all the monitors and everything, but they hadn't started yet, and they hadn't given me any of their anesthetic. And every once in a while, my blood pressure would just shoot up, and so would my heart rate, and my oxygen saturation would go down, and it would last for a few seconds, and then everything would normalize again. And this happened like 3 or 4 times. But every time it happened, the nurses would look at me, and I would show nothing. Finally, they were like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Why?" And they're like, "Well, you know, your blood pressure shoots up every once in a while. Like, is something going on?" I'm like, "Oh, no, it just does that when I'm in pain." And they were like, "Wait, you were in pain?" They couldn't tell. These were trained nurses. And they couldn't tell from any of my external signals that I was experiencing a high level of pain at those moments. The only reason they could tell was because of the heart rate monitors and everything that was going off. And so if these trained nurses, you know, who deal with patients every single day can't tell, what hope does a layman have?
Right.
You know? And this sort of backfires with me sometimes, too, because I can tolerate a fairly high level of pain. I can maintain a fairly decent discourse with somebody while in pain because I've had to practice that.
Right.
And so sometimes I'll go into the hospital and the doctors won't actually believe that I'm in pain because I'm able to describe to them what's going on.
Right.
Yeah, and I've kind of learned that from my mom because my mom has problems with her knees, and she's in pain most of the time. And I've had that conversation with her. She said something about her knee hurting, and I'm like, really? Like it doesn't seem like you're. And she's like, no, they pretty much always do. I've just kind of learned to live with it. And
that's another thing. I actually, and this also gets really awkward in hospitals because their favorite question about how much pain are you in is on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you hurt right now?
Right.
And the thing is because I'm in pain constantly, there's a huge chunk of my mental energy which goes to not feeling pain. So all of a sudden when I'm asked this question, I have to focus on feeling it again so that I can answer that question.
Right.
And so I have to take a few seconds where I'm actually concentrating on what's going on right now so that I can answer that question. But what they see is me hesitating.
Right.
And the thing is, and so I've actually started explaining to doctors, hang on, sorry, I've been focusing on ignoring it. I just have to pay attention to it now for a second. But it's awkward that I have to explain that to doctors constantly to get them to understand that, no, me answering that question is different from somebody who doesn't experience pain constantly because their bodies have to respond to pain at a moment's notice. My body has to learn to ignore it so it doesn't respond.
Right. Well, and I mean, you would think that doctors see enough people who deal with chronic pain that wouldn't be a thing that was foreign to them, like that.
Well, see, interestingly enough, doctors don't necessarily see that much chronic pain unless they're specifically chronic pain specialists.
I gotcha.
Even more than that, doctors, even more than seeing pain, chronic pain, in order to really understand it, you have to experience chronic pain. Because if I were to tell you that I'm in pain every single moment of every single day, unless you've been through that, it can be really hard to understand what that means. Because when people are imagining it, they're imagining the last time that they had, a broken bone or that something happened to them. And they're imagining that initial searing moment that's impossible to ignore.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't understand that it's actually more like that throbbing that happens immediately afterwards that lets you know that there is an injury there, but you're not in the process of being injured right now.
Well, in the thing that you mentioned a couple of times in the book that I think is important to keep in mind too is that whenever someone like me experiences pain, it's always in the context of it's going to end at some point. Even if it's going to be like a couple of days or a couple of weeks, I can look forward to a time where that pain is going to stop.
Yeah. So the fact that your heart rate is significantly accelerated, that your blood pressure is significantly accelerated, that, the majority of your brain power is currently taken up with concentrating on the fact that you're in pain, it doesn't matter because it's going to end. So you're not going to suffer long-term health consequences from paying attention to that pain. Whereas somebody who's experiencing it constantly, if I were to focus the way that you focus on initial pain, I would do nothing else.
Right.
I would be caught in a permanent stasis of just being in pain, needing to function, needing to feed myself, needing to take care of basically what I need to take care of in order to survive means that I have to learn to ignore that pain. My body has to learn to ignore that pain too.
Right. So I just think that's an important thing to kind of point out when we're talking about how fundamentally different the experience is, between, the pain that, most people are familiar with versus chronic pain is, it's a fundamentally different experience simply in the context of knowing that, whatever pain that I'm in is probably going to stop at some point and probably soon. Even the most awful things, the pain usually is like a matter of days or weeks, but, so it's a totally different thing. So I think that's because, I'm always kind of trying to walk the line between using examples of things to trigger empathy in people.
Yeah.
And saying like, for example, one of the best conversations that I've ever had about trans issues was the Trans 101 episode we did on our show. And I actually, I brought a guy on who specifically said that trans people made him uncomfortable. So I had a conversation and I brought him on the show and I said, okay, ask me all your questions and don't feel like you're going to offend me. Just throw whatever you have at me. And one of the things that made it click for him was when I was talking about, walking around and having people stare at me and laugh at me. What clicked for him is he was a black gentleman from New York, and he was like, that happens to me on the subway all the time. People stare at me, and because I'm black, they think I'm gonna rob them. They think I'm gonna, get violent or that I'm up to no good. So obviously, the experience of a trans person and the experience of a person of color are not the same thing. But there are certain parallels.
Yeah.
Right. There are certain parallels that you can use to sort of trigger someone's empathy. So I'm always kind of trying to walk the line between painting those things for people so people can better understand without going over to appropriating people's experiences and trying to say like, oh, I know exactly what you're going through because I broke my arm when I was 8 and it was terrible. I don't like that.
I mean, even within that, there is even something relatable because one thing that I can point out is if you've ever broken a limb, well, you don't feel that break every single moment of every single day, but that doesn't mean the break isn't there.
Right.
There is going to be a moment in which you forget about the fact that your arm is broken, and that's very much the same thing. Yeah. It's that I can sort of, to an extent, forget that I'm in constant pain. Does that mean I'm not in pain? No, it just means at this moment I'm kind of ignoring it. But ignoring it takes effort. It takes brain power.
Right, that saps energy away that would normally be used to do other things. Hence the don't get mad if I have to cancel plans kind of thing, because because there's energy is a very very finite thing when you're dealing with that kind of ththing. So that makes sense to me. Well, Ari, did you have anything before we wrap up here? You've been kind of quiet.
Yeah, I've just been sitting back and listening. Sometimes there are topics that we talk about that I have a lot of personal experience with, and this is not one of them. So I feel like the listeners are better served just to hear someone else's story on this.
Fair enough. Well, Ania, thank you so much for coming on the show, being so generous with your time and with your experience. Obviously, there's lots of unpleasantness, and I have so much respect for people who share experiences like that in hopes of helping other people and making other people feel less alone and helping people be better allies. I think. I can't recommend the book highly enough. It's a pretty quick read. I read it over the course of 2 days at work, when I had time. But it's brutally honest. It's very personal, very easy to understand. And I think, coming from the perspective of someone who is an ally in this situation, it's written in such a way that I think helped me to be able to understand as well as I can. Being a person who doesn't have that experience, I feel like I understand it as well as it would be possible for me to, given the way that it's described in the book. So I can't thank you enough for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for all the wonderful things you had to say. As an author, it's really nice to hear that I succeeded in what I was trying to do. So
yeah,
thank you.
Awesome. So the book is called Young, Sick, and Invisible: A Skeptic's Journey with Chronic Illness. You want to tell us where you can go online and find it?
Sure. If you go to, it's available on both Amazon.ca and Amazon.com. And I would imagine that whatever other whatevers there are of Amazon, it's available there as well. The publishing company is Pitchstone, and I believe you can find it through their sources as well. I believe it's available at Chapters in Canada, or at least I know it's available at Chapters in Canada, and I believe it's also available at Barnes & Noble or whatever the current bookstores there are, or which one's closed and which one's took over.
Right. It changes from minute to minute, it seems. So
one of them closed, like a big chain, and I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, Borders closed.
Borders, yeah, it was Borders that closed.
That's it. Yeah. So it's available at all of those places, and actually, if you go to the-orbit.net. That's the blog network for which I write, and I believe right now their current ad everywhere is for my book, so you can click from any of those ads to find it as well.
Yes, and the Orbit is a new atheism and social justice blogging platform started by Greta Christina, Hina Databoy, and a bunch of other amazing bloggers.
Yeah, it's a collective, so they would ask me to sort of to correct that
okay,
it's not like one specific person's project. It's a whole collective that got together, and all the decisions are made as a collective, and it's been pretty great so far. Like we all get to know each other, we all know each other pretty well now, and we discuss everything. And sometimes that means that our response to certain things is a little bit slower because we wait for everyone to
right.
And we span something like 6 or 7 time zones, and something at least 4 continents, I think.
Oh gosh!
So, wait, is it? Hang on, I know we definitely have some Europe. We have some people from the UK, Canada, the US. I can't even remember. I know we have just a big group of people that are all really great writers, and we're all basically working to make it the best network we can. So
yeah, and I'll put a link to that. I'll put a link to that in the show notes because the people that I know are involved the people that I know personally are people who I have a ton of respect for. So it's a great site. So that, my friends,
and my wife and I write a blog for that network called "Splain You a Thing" as well. So
I love that title.
Yeah, it's actually funny how it came up because I remember I was having a conversation with somebody in which I was like annoyed about this guy who had just come in to splain all over the thread, and I'm like, so you come in here saying, "Let me splain you a thing," and all my friends just started commenting on how they loved that expression, and I realized that so much of what Alyssa and I do is trying to explain things to people. So we decided that the right blog heading for us is, "Let us splain you a thing."
Oh, that's perfect. I love it so much.
I want it explained.
Well, that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network. I want to say thank you to my co-host, Ari.
I was here.
And again, big thanks to my guest, Ania Bula, for being so generous with their time and energy with their personal experiences and helping to make the movement a little bit more friendly for folks that it hasn't traditionally been friendly to. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at Gaytheist Callie, and I'm sure Ari has a thing.
Hello, Hedums. This the Spooner. I the good and perfect boy. I the cat of Maddie. I think you call Maddie Ari. Maddie give me stinky meat blobs sometimes, and I yike it, even though Maddie is filthy trans atheist who voted for Benzie Sanders and not for Ted Cruz like a good Christian. I pray for my daddy and my Maddie every night so they can find G-bums and go to heaven and not go to hell where there are no crunchy crunchies. Anyways, if you want to talk to my Maddie and try to tell them about G-bums, go on the Pewter Machine and go to Facebook and go find Always Stillman. Or you can go on the other thing and use your opposable thumbs to write a letter to alwaysstillman4@gmail.com. Oh, and if you know any nice Christian families looking for a kitty, write me a letter too. It is spooner@bestbaby.com. Also, give me food or I do the real loud meows in your face.
Well, Ara and I aren't friends anymore. And you can find And you can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheist. If you want to support the show, support the activism that we do, you can head to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can make a contribution in the amount as little as $1 per episode to help the activism that we do and to support the show. If financial support isn't a thing that's possible, you can still head to iTunes and give us a 5-star review to help us get heard by more people. Speaking of helping us get heard by more people, the show is now on Stitcher. Yay! Had a whole bunch of people ask me if the show's on Stitcher, and I had to hang my head low and tell them no in shame. And I got enough of those requests that I went ahead and did the thing, and the show is now on Stitcher. So if that's the way that you like consuming podcasts, you can find us there now. So before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.